My manager deliberately booked my performance review on the same day as my wedding and smirked. It's about priorities. I agreed, and made mine clear by emailing my resignation directly to her boss during her review. Turns out, timing lessons go both ways. I still vividly recall the exact moment my hands began to tremble. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, the fluorescent glow of the office ceiling mirroring the anodyne quarterly reports spread across my desk. Then, a calendar notification bloomed on my screen. Performance review with Deborah Winters. June 15th, 2 p.m. June 15th. My wedding day. For a solid 30 seconds, a desperate corner of my mind insisted it had to be a glitch, a clerical error. Deborah knew. The entire office knew. My time off request had been submitted 8 months prior, meticulously approved in writing. I'd even passed around save-the-date cards for everyone in our department. The date, a beacon of joy, had been circled in bright pink on the communal calendar since September. My thoughts raced, grasping at any alternative, a system malfunction, a temporary placeholder, anything but the sinking certainty my gut was already screaming. I'd dedicated 5 years to Morrison Financial, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school. My ascent was fueled by sheer determination, by an unwavering willingness to tackle the projects no one else touched. The initial 2 years were genuinely good. My first manager, a kind man named Dennis who now enjoyed retirement in Florida, had carefully mentored me, nudging me toward leadership and writing glowing performance reviews that opened doors. When he departed, I felt optimistic about his replacement. Deborah Winters arrived with an impressive resume and a reputation for revitalizing underperforming departments. The first 6 months were professional. She seemed competent, if somewhat aloof, more preoccupied with metrics than human connection. I rationalized it, telling myself that not every boss needed warmth to be effective. The shift, when it came, was insidious. Gradual. Small comments about my work, delivered with an edge I couldn't quite pinpoint. Projects inexplicably reassigned at the 11th hour. Meetings where my contributions were coolly summarized by Deborah as if they'd been her insights all along. I kept dismissing it, convincing myself I was paranoid, imagining patterns where none existed. Then, 6 months ago, a client praise email landed, and suddenly, those scattered patterns crystallized into something undeniable. I walked toward Deborah's office, each step measured, my phone clutched like a lifeline. She was typing, her reading glasses perched precariously, and she didn't bother to look up when I tapped lightly on her open door. "Deborah," I began, my voice a professional veneer over the anxiety clawing at my throat. "I think there might be an error with my performance review scheduling. It's showing June 15th, but that's my wedding day. I have approved PTO." She finally glanced up, and the slight curve of her lips sent a jolt of dread through me. It wasn't a smile of embarrassment or apologetic recognition. It was something else entirely. "No error," she stated, her attention already drifting back to her computer. "That's when the review is scheduled. All reviews are happening that week, and that's your slot. But I won't be here. I'll be getting married. My fiancé and I have been planning this for over a year." Deborah removed her glasses, fixing me with a gaze I'd seen her reserve for underperforming interns. "Rachel, if you want to advance in this company, you need to demonstrate commitment. Anyone can have a wedding. Not everyone can prove they're serious about their career. I submitted the request 8 months ago. It was approved by HR. Approved PTO can be reconsidered based on business needs." She replaced her glasses, a clear dismissal. "Priorities, Rachel. You need to figure out what yours are." I stood frozen in her doorway, the weight of her words crushing me. Deborah Winters, my manager for the past 3 years, had just ordered me to choose between my wedding and my career. The same Deborah who had taken 2 weeks off for her daughter's destination wedding in Cancun last summer. The same Deborah who left early every Thursday for hot yoga, declaring it a mental health necessity. "There has to be another time slot," I managed, desperation lacing my voice. "Any other day that week. I can come in the Monday before or the Friday after. The schedule is set." She didn't look up again. Close the door on your way out. My legs carried me from her office on autopilot. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed too harsh, the carpet pattern too geometrically precise. Everything felt subtly askew, as if I'd stepped into a photograph tilted just 2 degrees. I passed the break room, where someone was microwaving fish. The conference room, where a client call was underway. The supply closet, where I'd once hidden for 10 minutes after Deborah publicly shredded my presentation in front of the entire department. That memory surfaced unbidden. It was during a quarterly review meeting 4 months ago. I'd poured 3 weeks into preparing a comprehensive analysis of our regional performance. The data was irrefutable, the visualizations crystal clear. I'd rehearsed until I could deliver it in my sleep. 7 minutes in, Deborah had interrupted me to pinpoint a decimal error on slide 14, a typo that altered nothing about the underlying conclusions, but gave her an opening to question my attention to detail. Before Christopher Matthews and 2 visiting executives. I'd maintained my composure, smiled, acknowledged the error, and continued. But afterward, pressed against the shelf of printer paper in the supply closet, I breathed through what felt like a full-blown panic attack. My coworker Heather had found me there. She said nothing, simply handed me a tissue, and stood silent guard until I was ready to face the world again. That was the day I'd started keeping records. Nothing formal, just a private document on my personal laptop, logging dates and interactions that felt fundamentally wrong. I told myself it was for my sanity, a way to confirm I wasn't imagining things. The document had swelled to 47 entries over 4 months. Entry 48 would be about the wedding day performance review. I walked back to my desk in a daze. Heather noticed immediately. She'd been with the company almost as long as I had, and we'd forged the kind of friendship born from surviving corporate absurdity together. What happened? You look like you just saw a ghost. I recounted the exchange, watching her expression morph from confusion to outrage, then to something harder to define. Rachel, you know this isn't normal, right? This is Deborah being Deborah. Heather lowered her voice conspiratorially. She's been gunning for you ever since you got that client praise that should have gone through her. She wasn't wrong. 6 months earlier, I had solved a major problem for our biggest account. The client, impressed, had sent a glowing email directly to our department director, Christopher Matthews, bypassing Deborah entirely. Christopher had mentioned it at a company-wide meeting, and I'd witnessed Deborah's face contort into something ugly before she rearranged it into a stiff smile. From that day forward, every interaction with her carried an edge. The client issue had been genuinely intricate. A software migration had corrupted 3 months of transaction data, and their internal team was convinced the problem lay with us. Deborah had assigned it to me with what I now recognized as a deliberate setup for failure. The deadline was ludicrous, the scope nebulous, and she'd offered 0 resources or guidance. I'd solved it anyway. I worked through 2 weekends, coordinated with their IT department, uncovered the actual source of the corruption, and implemented a fix that recovered 97% of the lost data. The client CEO was so impressed, he wrote directly to Christopher, circumventing the usual channels entirely. He called me a problem solver of the highest caliber, and suggested I be considered for client relationship management roles. Christopher read excerpts from that email at the company meeting while I sat there, turning progressively redder. I glanced at Deborah during the applause and saw something in her eyes that made my stomach clench. She was smiling, clapping along, but her gaze was flat, calculating. The project reassignments began the following week. The subtle criticisms intensified. My access to high-visibility work evaporated almost overnight. And now, 6 months later, she was demanding I attend a performance review on my wedding day. What am I supposed to do? I asked Heather, the question hanging heavy between us. Just not show up to my own wedding? Have you talked to HR? I hadn't. At that point, I still harbored a naive faith in the system. I believed that explaining the situation to reasonable people would yield a reasonable solution. That evening, I told my fiancé, Marcus, what had happened. We were sitting in our apartment, takeout containers spread across the coffee table, and I watched his jaw tighten as I recounted the conversation. "She can't actually force you to miss our wedding for a work meeting," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "That's insane. Technically, she's not forcing me. She's just making it clear that missing the review will impact my career. Rachel, we've been together for 6 years. We've been planning this wedding for 14 months. Your mother has already flown in from Arizona. My parents booked their flights in January. We have 120 guests coming. I know all of that. Then this shouldn't even be a question." He was right, of course. But Marcus worked in a field where autonomy and respect were commonplace, where his boss would never dream of pulling such a stunt. He couldn't grasp the particular flavor of corporate hostage-taking that characterized my workplace. The next morning, I went to HR. I sat across from a woman named Patricia, who listened with practiced neutrality, nodding at appropriate intervals, then calmly explained that while my PTO was indeed approved, performance reviews were mandatory attendance events, and missing one could result in disciplinary action. "But the review was scheduled after my PTO was approved," I pointed out, my voice rising. "Deliberately scheduled on a day my manager knew I wouldn't be available." Patricia's expression remained unchanged. "I understand your frustration, but I don't have any evidence that the scheduling was deliberate. These reviews are assigned based on availability in the calendar system. My availability clearly shows I'm on PTO that day. I'll make a note of your concern." She closed her laptop with a definitive click, signaling the end of our conversation. "My advice would be to speak with your manager about finding a resolution." I had already done that. Patricia knew I had already done that. But HR, I realized, existed to protect the company. Deborah had been there for 3 years with a spotless record, at least on paper. I was just another employee with a complaint. Walking out of HR, something fundamental shifted inside me. My naive belief that fairness would prevail if I simply followed the proper channels began to crumble. Patricia had barely typed a word during our conversation. She'd made no promises, offered no alternatives, showed no indication that my situation warranted any investigation or intervention. I'd seen this dynamic play out before. Watched good people bring legitimate grievances to HR only to be redirected back to the very managers causing their problems. There was a woman named Shelley in accounting who had complained about her supervisor's inappropriate comments. HR had facilitated a mediation session, after which Shelley was transferred to a different department with fewer advancement opportunities. The supervisor kept his position, his corner office, and his inappropriate behavior. The message was always the same: complain if you must, but understand that complaints have consequences, and those consequences rarely fall upon the people in positions of power. Over the following weeks, I tried everything. I sent emails requesting alternate times, CCING Patricia. I cornered Christopher Matthews in the hallway, attempting to explain, but he waved me off with a vague assurance that he trusted his managers to handle scheduling appropriately. I even approached Deborah one last time, practically begging for any other slot. And she told me that if I couldn't handle a simple scheduling conflict, perhaps I wasn't ready for the responsibilities that came with advancement. Meanwhile, wedding preparations continued. Marcus and I met with our caterer, finalized the seating chart, and had our final fitting at the tailor. Every tool bow and menu selection felt shadowed by the impossible choice looming over me. My mother called from Arizona every few days, bubbling with excitement about the trip, asking about the venue and the flowers and whether Uncle Richard would behave himself. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. She would have flown out immediately, marched into Morrison Financial, and caused a scene that would have made everything infinitely worse. So, I smiled through our phone calls and pretended that work was fine, that everything was proceeding according to plan. Marcus noticed. Of course, he noticed. We'd been together long enough that he could read my silences as easily as my words. He'd find me staring at my laptop at midnight, not typing, just scrolling through old emails. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. to an empty bed, only to discover me on the couch, wedding planning spreadsheets open on my tablet but completely untouched. One night, about 3 weeks before the wedding, he sat down beside me and gently took the tablet from my hands. Talk to me, he said, his voice soft but firm. Really? Talk to me. What's going through your head? I tried to explain. The feeling of being trapped between two impossible options. The agonizing knowledge that whatever I chose, something precious would be sacrificed. The way Deborah had somehow managed to insert herself into the most important day of my life, twisting what should have been pure joy into a cold calculation of professional consequences. You know what keeps me up at night? I finally admitted, the words spilling out. It's not just the wedding. It's that she's going to keep doing this. If I cave on this, if I show up to that review, she'll know exactly how to control me forever. Every future milestone, every important moment, she'll find a way to make me choose. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then don't let her. It's not that simple. Maybe it is. He pulled me closer. Maybe the only way to stop someone like her is to stop playing by rules that only apply to you. I didn't fully grasp what he meant at the time, but his words planted something in the back of my mind, a tiny seed of possibility that would eventually blossom into a plan. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received another calendar notification. The performance review had been moved to 11 a.m. Still June 15th. Still my wedding day. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m., which meant that even if I attended the review, I'd be spending my wedding morning in a sterile conference room, being evaluated by someone who clearly wished me ill. I showed Marcus the notification that night, and something in his face hardened. She moved it earlier, he said flatly. Not to a different day. Just earlier. So you'd have to be at the office until at least noon on your wedding day. I know. Rachel. This woman is trying to ruin the most important day of our lives, and you're still trying to accommodate her. What choice do I have? If I skip the review, I could lose my job. Then maybe you need to lose that job. It was the first time either of us had voiced it aloud. I'd dedicated 5 years to Morrison Financial. I'd built relationships, earned promotions, developed expertise that felt specific to that company. Starting over somewhere else felt terrifying. But Marcus was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Disappointment, perhaps, or exhaustion. I've been patient, he said, his voice steadier than I expected. I've listened to you talk about Deborah for 3 years. The snide comments, the stolen credit, the way she makes you feel like you're always one mistake away from disaster. And every time, you've told me you can handle it, that it's not worth making waves. That things will get better if you just work harder and keep your head down. That's not fair, is it? He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights. Rachel, I love you. I want to spend my life with you. But I'm watching this job eat you alive, and now it's trying to eat our wedding too. At some point, you have to decide if the fight is worth what you're losing. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your career, he said quietly. I'm asking you to choose between me and Deborah Winters. Because if you go to that review instead of getting ready for our wedding, you're telling her that she wins. You're telling her she can treat you however she wants, and you'll just take it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, replaying every interaction with Deborah over the past 3 years. Every subtle put-down, every piece of credit she'd stolen, every time she'd smiled at me while sliding a knife between my ribs. I thought about the client praise email that had ignited her vendetta, about Patricia's carefully neutral expression, about Christopher Matthews walking away before I could finish my sentence. By morning, I had made a decision. But it wasn't the one Marcus expected. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to skip the review. I wasn't going to beg Deborah for mercy one more time. I was going to burn the entire thing to the ground. The plan coalesced over the next 10 days. Heather helped, though she didn't know the full extent of what I was preparing. She believed I was merely gathering documentation to file a formal complaint after the wedding. In reality, I was constructing something far more comprehensive. The private document I'd been keeping for 4 months became my foundation. 48 entries detailing incidents, dates, witnesses, and my raw emotional responses at the time. Reading through them sequentially was painful. I could trace the gradual escalation, the The way Deborah's behavior had intensified after any perceived slight or success on my part. The pattern was unmistakable, laid out chronologically. First, I collected every email Deborah had ever sent me, every passive-aggressive barb, every unreasonable demand, every instance where she'd claimed credit for my work in writing. I pulled the original client praise email and Deborah's subsequent messages criticizing my grandstanding. I documented the project assignments she'd given me versus those she'd kept for herself, illustrating a clear pattern of high-visibility work flowing to her favorites while I was buried under administrative tasks. There was an email from October where she'd CC'd the entire department on a criticism of my expense report formatting. The formatting had been correct according to company policy. She'd simply invented a new requirement and used my supposed failure to establish me as careless with details. Another email from December congratulated the team on landing a new client, a client I had personally courted for 6 months, while Deborah contributed nothing but her signature on the final contract. Second, I reached out to former employees. 3 people had left the department in the past 2 years, and I found 2 of them on LinkedIn. Both were willing to talk. Both had stories that chillingly echoed mine. One woman, Gina, told me Deborah had scheduled her performance review during her chemotherapy appointment, suggesting that if she was healthy enough to work, she was healthy enough to attend a meeting. Gina's story haunted me. Diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years prior, she tried to continue working through treatment, managing responsibilities while battling debilitating side effects. Deborah responded by increasing her workload, questioning her commitment, and ultimately creating conditions so hostile that Gina resigned rather than fighting on 2 fronts. This had happened before the client praise incident, proving that Deborah's cruelty wasn't personal, it was simply inherent. I should have reported her, Gina confided over the phone, her voice heavy with regret. I had documentation. I had witnesses, but I was so tired. Rachel, fighting cancer took everything I had. I couldn't fight Deborah, too. The other former employee, a man named Thomas, had left for a competitor after Deborah passed him over for a promotion he'd been promised. He recounted how she dangled advancement in front of him for 2 years, always finding reasons to delay, always moving the goalpost just as he thought he'd met her requirements. When he finally confronted her about the pattern, she informed him that his aggressive attitude was precisely why he wasn't ready for leadership. She called me aggressive. Thomas laughed bitterly. I'm literally the least confrontational person you'll ever meet. But that's her trick, right? She invents narratives and then acts like they're established facts. I recorded our conversations with their permission. I transcribed the relevant portions and added them to my growing documentation folder. Third, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. While digging through old project files for documentation, I found discrepancies in the expense reports Deborah had submitted for a client dinner last October. The dinner had been for 3 people. The receipt showed charges for 7, nearly $400 in overcharges buried in a quarterly expense report that had been rubber-stamped without review. I wasn't even looking for financial fraud. I was looking for evidence of hostile management. But sometimes the universe hands you exactly what you need. The discovery was almost accidental. I was searching for an email thread where Deborah had criticized my work, trying to recall the specific language she'd used. The search function pulled up a folder I hadn't accessed in months, containing expense reports from a client development initiative last fall. I'd been on that initiative. The dinner in question had been a legitimate business expense. A meeting with potential clients at an upscale downtown restaurant. I remembered the event clearly because Deborah had insisted on attending at the last minute, turning what should have been a relaxed, relationship-building meal into a tense performance review conducted over appetizers. There had been 3 people at that dinner, me, Deborah, and the prospective client. That was it. The expense report, however, showed charges for 7 people. Wine bottles I didn't remember ordering. Desserts that nobody had eaten. An amount that nearly doubled the actual cost of the meal. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Some administrative error, a wrong receipt attached to the wrong report. But the itemized charges told a different story. Specific dishes, specific wines, specific quantities that could only have been intentionally fabricated. I dug deeper, found the original receipt attached to a different file, the actual receipt from the restaurant showing the real total. Someone had created a modified version, added fictional charges, and submitted it as a legitimate expense. The signatures matched Deborah's handwriting. For nearly an hour, I sat at my desk, staring at my screen, trying to process what I'd unearthed. This wasn't just documentation of bad management. This was evidence of fraud, potentially criminal fraud, depending on how much money was involved across how many expense reports. I photographed everything. I organized it into a folder with clear labels and dates. I wrote a timeline that showed the pattern of retaliation following the client praise incident. I included the names and contact information of the former employees willing to corroborate, noting that their experiences predated mine and established a longer pattern of misconduct. The folder grew larger than I expected. When I finally assembled all the pieces, I had over 70 pages of documentation. Emails, screenshots, timeline entries, transcripts, and the explosive evidence of financial misconduct. Looking at it spread across my laptop screen felt surreal, like I was seeing my professional life through a forensic lens for the first time. Heather noticed the change. We were having lunch in the break room 3 days before my wedding when she asked me directly, "You seem different. Calmer than you've been in weeks. What happened?" I couldn't tell her about the expense report fraud. That was too dangerous to share before I'd made my move. But I could share a version of the truth. "I made a decision," I said, "about the performance review situation. You're going to skip it?" "Something like that." Heather leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Rachel, whatever you're planning, be careful. Deborah has allies. Christopher trusts her. If you come at her and miss, she'll make your life hell." "I know." I took a bite of my sandwich, surprised by how steady my hands were. "That's why I'm not going to miss." June 14th arrived. My rehearsal dinner was that evening, and my family was already in town. My mother kept asking if I was nervous, and I kept saying yes because I was, just not about the wedding. At 9 p.m., I sent an email. It went to Christopher Matthews, Patricia in HR, and Harrison Webb, the Chief Operating Officer. The subject line was chillingly formal. Formal complaint regarding Deborah Winters. Documentation attached. The email meticulously detailed 6 months of retaliatory behavior directed at me, combined with corroborating accounts from former employees that established a years-long pattern of misconduct. It included the expense report discrepancies, clearly labeled and sourced. It noted that I would not be attending the scheduled review and that any disciplinary action taken against me would be met with legal consultation. Then I turned off my phone and went to my rehearsal dinner. The dinner was at a small Italian restaurant Marcus and I loved. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths, candles flickering in wine bottles, and an owner who remembered your name. Both families were there, awkwardly mingling across generations and geographic divides. My mother kept touching my arm, as if she couldn't quite believe the wedding was truly happening. Marcus's father gave an impromptu toast that made everyone laugh. For a few hours, I completely forgot about Morrison Financial. I allowed myself to exist in the simple joy of being surrounded by people who loved me, who had traveled hundreds of miles to celebrate the promise Marcus and I were about to make. My sister cornered me near the dessert table and demanded to know if I was nervous, and I realized with some surprise that I wasn't. The wedding itself felt like the easy part now. The hard part was already done. The email was sent. Whatever happened next would unfold without any further action required from me. That night, lying in the hotel room I'd booked so Marcus wouldn't see me before the ceremony, I imagined Deborah opening her email Monday morning. I pictured her clicking on my name, expecting some last-minute plea for schedule accommodation, and finding instead a comprehensive indictment of her management practices. I envisioned her scrolling through the expense report documentation, the realization dawning that her carefully constructed professional image was about to collapse. Part of me felt a flicker of guilt, a small, fading part that had been trained to avoid conflict, to prioritize other people's comfort, to believe that fighting back was somehow inappropriate. But that part of me was getting quieter by the hour. June 15th was beautiful. Clear skies, warm without being oppressive, the kind of day that makes you believe the universe is paying attention. I got ready at the venue with my bridesmaids, deliberately pushing all thoughts of Morrison Financial from my mind. My mother helped with my veil. My sister fixed my makeup when I started crying during my vows. Marcus and I exchanged rings in front of everyone we loved. We danced our first dance to a song we'd chosen during a road trip 3 years earlier. My father made a toast that was somehow both embarrassing and perfect. By the time the reception wound down, I had almost forgotten about Deborah Winters entirely. The reminder came the following Monday. I had taken the week after my wedding off as well, so I wasn't checking work email, but Heather texted me with a single line. "You need to call me immediately." When I reached her, she was barely coherent with excitement. "Deborah is gone," she practically shrieked. "They walked her out this morning. Security escorted her to her car." "What?" My new husband, Marcus, who was watching me with raised eyebrows from the hotel bed where we were spending our honeymoon week, looked amused by my shock. "Your email, Rachel! Your email went to Harrison Webb. He read it over the weekend. He apparently called an emergency meeting with Christopher and Patricia first thing this morning. They pulled the expense reports going back 3 years and found more discrepancies. They're talking about an audit." I sat down on the edge of the bed. "There's more," Heather continued, catching her breath. "You know how Deborah was supposed to have her own performance review with Christopher today? It was scheduled for 2 p.m. Instead, at 2 p.m., she was in HR being told to pack her desk. The timing hadn't been intentional. I'd sent my email the night before my wedding because that was when I had all my documentation ready. But the fact that Deborah's termination happened during what should have been her own review felt like poetry. I couldn't have written better myself. I returned to work the following week to a vastly different landscape. Christopher Matthews called me into his office on my first day back and apologized. He admitted he hadn't been aware of the extent of the situation, that he should have listened when I tried to speak with him, and that he was committed to fostering a healthier department culture. Patricia sent an email expressing regret that my concerns hadn't been addressed sooner. The expense report investigation expanded. They found nearly $12,000 in fraudulent charges over a 4-year period. Deborah wasn't just fired, she was facing potential legal action. 3 months later, I was promoted to Deborah's former position. The announcement came during a department meeting, and I watched the faces of my colleagues as Christopher read the press release. Some looked genuinely surprised. Some smiled knowingly. Heather gave me a small nod that contained everything she couldn't say in that moment. The job came with a significant raise and an office with a window. On my first day in that office, I strategically moved the desk so I could always see the door. No one would ever be dismissed the way Deborah had dismissed me. No one would ever have to stand in a doorway, waiting for acknowledgement that wouldn't come. Last month, I received a LinkedIn request from a woman I didn't recognize. Her profile showed she worked at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. Her message was brief. "I heard what happened at Morrison. I used to work for Deborah at her previous company. If you ever need confirmation that you did the right thing, I have stories." I accepted the request. I read her stories. They were worse than mine. Marcus and I recently celebrated our first anniversary. We went back to the venue where we got married and had dinner at the same restaurant where we'd held our rehearsal. Over dessert, he asked if I ever regretted how things played out. "The timing was petty," I admitted, a slight smile playing on my lips. "Sending the email the night before my wedding so her consequences would land during her performance review. That was deliberate." "Do you feel bad about it?" he asked, a twinkle in his eye. I considered the question seriously. I thought about Gina and her chemotherapy appointments. I thought about the woman on LinkedIn and her horrifying stories. I thought about every person Deborah had stepped on during her climb, every career she damaged, every moment of cruelty she disguised as professionalism. "No," I said finally. "She taught me about priorities. I just happened to be a faster learner than she expected. Marcus raised his glass. To excellent timing. I clinked my glass against his. To excellent timing. The office with the window is still mine. The department culture has genuinely improved. Heather got promoted last quarter, and we still have lunch together every Wednesday. Christopher Matthews treats me as a peer now rather than an obstacle, and Patricia and I have developed something approaching mutual respect. I keep the email I sent on June 14th saved in a personal folder. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes the system does work. Sometimes documentation matters. Sometimes the person who tries to make you choose between your life and your job ends up losing both of theirs. Deborah Winters taught me that priorities matter. She just never imagined I'd prioritize myself. I found out recently that Deborah landed at another company, a smaller firm, a lower title, a significant pay cut. I heard through the professional grapevine that she's already developing a reputation there, that the same patterns are emerging, that at least 2 junior employees have already started looking for exits. Part of me wanted to reach out to them, to warn them about what they were dealing with, to offer the kind of documentation strategy that had worked for me. But I've learned that some lessons have to be lived before they can be applied. Those employees will figure it out eventually, or they won't. My story is already written. What I've come to understand is that people like Deborah don't just happen. They're created by systems that reward their behavior, by supervisors who look the other way, by HR departments that prioritize ease over justice. Christopher Matthews had 12 years to notice what Deborah was doing. Patricia had access to every complaint that was ever filed. The expense report fraud had been sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to look. I was just angry enough to look. The woman from LinkedIn, the one who worked for Deborah at her previous company, she told me that she tried to file complaints years ago. Nothing happened. No investigation, no consequences, no acknowledgement. The difference between her experience and mine wasn't courage or strategy. It was luck. I happened to send my email to someone who happened to take it seriously at a moment when they happened to be paying attention. That's the part they don't tell you in the revenge stories. The satisfaction isn't guaranteed. The victory isn't inevitable. Sometimes you do everything right and nothing changes. And you have to live with the knowledge that you tried while watching the person who hurt you continue to thrive. I got lucky. I got married. I got the job. I got to watch Deborah Winters walk out of the building with a cardboard box in her arms on the same day she thought she'd be cementing her authority over my career. But every time I sit in my office and look out that window, I think about all the people who didn't get lucky. The ones who are still dealing with their own Deborah, still trying to decide whether to stay or go, still wondering if the system will ever work in their favor. To those people, I can only offer this: document everything. Build your case slowly and carefully. Find allies where you can. And when the moment comes, when you finally have leverage, don't hesitate. Don't second guess. Don't let them convince you that your priorities are wrong. Some battles are worth fighting even when you might lose, but it certainly helps when you win. My wedding photos hang on the wall of my new office. Marcus picked out the frames. In my favorite picture, we're both laughing at something my father said, completely unaware of the camera, completely present in a moment that belonged only to us. Deborah tried to take that day from me. Instead, she gave me something more valuable than any performance review could have provided. She gave me the certainty that I would never let anyone make me choose between my life and my dignity again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently. If I'd simply skipped the review without sending the email, accepted whatever disciplinary action followed, and moved on with my life, would Deborah still be at Morrison Financial, making someone else miserable? Would the expense report fraud have eventually been discovered through some other channel? I'll never know the answers. What I do know is that taking action, making a choice instead of passively accepting the situation imposed on me, changed something fundamental about how I see myself. For years, I'd been the person who kept her head down, who followed the rules, who believed that hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Deborah taught me that sometimes the rules are designed to protect the people breaking them. The expense report investigation revealed more than anyone expected. $12,000 in fraudulent charges over 4 years, spanning dozens of client dinners and department events. Deborah had been systematically padding her expenses, trusting that the approval process was too routine for anyone to scrutinize the details. She was right, until she made an enemy willing to look. I've heard through professional channels that she's tried to spin the story. Claimed she was wrongfully terminated, that the expense report issues were accounting errors, that I orchestrated a vindictive campaign against her because I couldn't handle constructive criticism. Some people probably believe her. There are always people willing to believe that women who speak up are really the problem. But the people who matter know the truth. Gina knows, Thomas knows, the woman from LinkedIn knows, and I know, and I think that is the real victory. Not the promotion or the office or even watching her face consequences for years of cruelty. The real victory is knowing exactly who I am and what I'm willing to accept. Deborah Winters was right about one thing. Priorities matter. I figured out mine.